Did you know that there's a Bible verse that says we're not supposed to wear polyester? That's 100% a true fact. So why have I never heard a sermon on the moral dangers of mixing fabrics? What other Bible verses get ignored so often that they seem random and ridiculous? How do preachers decide what passages to preach on? And why do we hear the same passages over and over and over again? How many times are we supposed to be shocked that mustard seeds grow real big?
Mustard is made from mustard seeds.
Well, if your church or denomination uses a lectionary, that standard repetition is kind of the point. Lectionaries are basically a limited list of scripture options for each Sunday. The word lection actually means a reading from a particular text, in this case, the Bible, meaning that a lectionary is a selection of lection collections for weekly spiritual direction, reflection, and occasional resurrection. But that's only once a year. Or twice if you squeeze in Lazarus during Lent. One of the most common lectionaries used in most mainline Protestant and Catholic denominations is called the Revised Common Lectionary. And if your church uses this tool, that just means that every Sunday they get to pick from 4, sometimes 5 scripture choices that week. Usually they include a passage from the Old Testament, a psalm, something from one of the Gospels, and a passage from one of the epistles. The epistles, by the way, are all the books in the New Testament that aren't the Gospels: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. So, when pastors are planning their worship services using a lectionary, they decide on whether they want to preach on an Old Testament story, a psalm, a Jesus story, or on a letter probably written by Paul. But why would churches want to limit their options like this? What if the people really want sermons on polyester? What is the advantage to using a lectionary in the first place? Well, some denominations require their pastors to preach from the lectionary, and they'd need special permission to preach anything else. But many churches choose to use the lectionary because it corresponds to the Christian calendar year. During Advent, all the suggested readings are about preparing for the birth of Jesus. And during Lent, they're all about Jesus' teachings and preparing for his death. Usually, the gospel selection directly relates to where we are in the Christian calendar. And then the Old Testament and other readings are theologically or thematically related to that particular gospel story. By following the lectionary, churches can actually get a full narrative of the Bible without actually reading every single story in just one calendar year. And because the Revised Common Lectionary is a 3-year cycle, you won't actually hear the same scripture more than once in 3 years. Which, 1, stops pastors from just preaching on their favorite passages over and over again, and 2, allows less popular Bible stories more time to shine when they're not competing for those coveted 52 slots. But even with 3 years and 4 options every single week, which is about 624 different lections, the lectionary still can't hold every single passage in the Bible. So who gets to decide what makes the cut? Well, in United Methodist history, our first lectionary was written by our founder, John Wesley, who apparently had way too much free time. Wesley based the first Methodist lectionary off of the 1662 Book of Common Prayer of the Church of England, but it was a 1-year cycle. But in 1792, the General Conference decided to no longer use a formal lectionary for worship, choosing instead to suggest reading 1 Old and 1 New Testament reading each week. And it wasn't until 1945 that the first United Methodist Book of Worship included a brand new lectionary. This was still a 1-year cycle, but it did include the psalm and epistle readings too. However, during Vatican II, the Catholic Church published their first full 3-year lectionary, which obviously everyone else was super jealous of. But really, it incited a beautiful ecumenical effort. It prompted the formation of the Consultation on Common Text, which was a group of delegates from various Protestant and Catholic denominations across North America. The CCT first met in the 70s, but wouldn't officially publish their first lectionary draft until 1983. This was called the Common Lectionary. The Common Lectionary was a 3-year cycle with 4 readings every week from the Old Testament, the Psalms, the Gospels, and the Epistles. Because this was a 3-year cycle, the Common Lectionary was broken up into Year A, Year B, and Year C. And the narrative theme for each of these years was largely determined by each of the Gospels. For instance, Year A contains readings from the book of Matthew, Year B focuses on Mark, and Year C is all about Luke. John's kind of just thrown in there whenever there's little room, mostly during important seasons of the Christian year like Advent, Lent, and Easter. Some of the Old Testament readings are also determined by the lectionary years. Year A contains the stories of the Abrahamic family and the Exodus narratives. Year B contains stories of the Davidic monarchy, aka the biblical kings, and Year C focuses on the prophets. After publishing in 1983, the CCT asked participating denominations to participate in the lectionary for 2 full cycles, or 6 years, after which they met again to revise based on everyone's feedback who used it. A few years later, in 1992, they published the Revised Common Lectionary, just in time to be included in the 1992 edition of the Book of Worship. And it has been used as the standard lectionary for most mainline Protestant and Catholic denominations ever since. So if you're ever on a tour of church services on a Sunday morning and are wondering how all these pastors somehow decided to preach on the exact same scripture, it turns out that it was a careful and collaborative decision over 300 years in the making, and no one wanted to talk about polyester.